What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected and uncompromising actors finally reaches his breaking point? Under the unforgiving glare of live television lights, what unfolds when decades of discipline, restraint, and carefully managed public appearances give way to a surge of unfiltered emotion in front of millions of viewers, watching from their living rooms on this particular afternoon? What was supposed to be a routine promotional stop turned into something far more volatile and unforgettable. The audience expected the usual rhythm of daytime television: warm introductions, lighthearted banter, a few anecdotes from the set of the new film, perhaps a humorous behind-the-scenes story, and then a gracious goodbye. Instead, they witnessed a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and debated across social media for weeks. The studio of The View hummed with its typical pre-show energy, but beneath the polished surface, there was a current of anticipation that felt unusually charged. Crew members moved briskly across the floor, adjusting microphones, checking lighting angles, and whispering last-minute instructions into headsets. The audience, packed tightly into their seats, sensed something different in the air when the actor introduced grandly as one of the greatest performers of his generation walked onto the stage. Applause filled the room. Yet even as he smiled politely and took his seat, there was a stiffness in his posture that did not go unnoticed. His handshake was firm but brief. His expression, though courteous, carried a seriousness that hinted this might not be the easygoing appearance producers had hoped for. He was there to promote his latest film, a project he had poured months of work into, immersing himself once again in a complex character that demanded emotional depth and precision. Normally, interviews like this were part of the routine, a necessary extension of the craft, a way to connect with audiences and build anticipation. However, something about his body language suggested that he was bracing himself rather than relaxing into the conversation. He leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers interlocked, eyes scanning the table as if measuring the mood before a storm. Across from him sat Joy Behar, a co-host widely recognized for her sharp wit and unapologetically confrontational interviewing style. She had built a reputation on challenging guests, often steering conversations towards social and political commentary even when the original purpose of the segment was purely promotional. That afternoon, her demeanor carried a certain edge and eagerness that seemed less about celebrating the film and more about probing the actor's public persona. The pre-interview briefing had reportedly established boundaries: focus on the movie, avoid veering into controversial territory, and respect the guest's preferences, including his request to be addressed by his full name, Robert. But live television has a way of unraveling even the most carefully laid plans. As the cameras rolled and the conversation began, the first few minutes followed a predictable pattern. There were compliments about his illustrious career, references to iconic performances, and a brief discussion of the film's themes. The actor responded with measured professionalism, speaking thoughtfully about his character's motivations and the collaborative process of filmmaking. His voice was steady, his words deliberate. Then the shift happened. Joy leaned forward slightly, a familiar smirk playing at the corner of her lips. Instead of continuing with questions about the film's storyline or the creative challenges behind it, she pivoted sharply, ignoring his previously stated preference. She addressed him casually and launched into a topic that had not been part of the agreed-upon discussion. I have to ask about your recent comments on the political climate, she began. Some people say you've become a little too outspoken for an actor. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. His jaw tightened so subtly that casual viewers might have missed it, but close observers could see the shift. The easy politeness in his eyes hardened, replaced by something more guarded. Just off camera, his publicist shifted uncomfortably, aware that this was precisely the line of questioning they had hoped to avoid. The atmosphere grew heavier, the audience unsure whether to laugh, clap, or remain silent. For years, the actor had been candid about his beliefs, unafraid to speak his mind on issues he felt strongly about, but he had also expressed frustration with the expectation that artists should remain silent outside their craft. The question, framed as a gentle critique, carried an implication that his opinions somehow undermined his legitimacy as an actor. It was the kind of remark that can feel dismissive. Reducing decades of artistry to a talking point about controversy, he inhaled slowly, as if choosing his next words with care. The camera zoomed in, capturing every nuance of his expression. Millions watched, sensing that this was no longer a routine exchange. The interview had crossed into personal territory, and the balance of control in the conversation was shifting. What happened next would spark headlines and ignite debates. Across the internet, was the question fair, or was it a calculated attempt to provoke? Was his reaction justified, or did it confirm the very criticism being implied? Regardless of where viewers stood, one thing was undeniable: this was no ordinary promotional interview. It was a collision of personality, principle, and the unpredictable nature of live television unfolding in real time before an audience that would not soon forget it. "Well, Joy," Robert began, his voice steady but edged with a restrained irritation that was becoming increasingly difficult to conceal. "I think actors have every right to express their opinions. Just like any other American citizen, we're not just dancing monkeys here for entertainment." The phrase hung in the air longer than anyone expected. It wasn't shouted, nor was it delivered with theatrical flair. Instead, it came out measured and deliberate, which somehow made it more powerful. A ripple of murmurs passed through the studio audience. Some shifted in their seats. Others leaned forward, sensing that the conversation had crossed an invisible boundary. Joy leaned in almost immediately, her expression sharpening. There was a familiar glint in her eyes, the kind viewers had seen countless times when she felt confident she was pressing a guest into a corner. "Oh, come on," she interrupted, her tone laced with disbelief. "Don't you think there's a difference between having an opinion and using your platform to influence people who might not be as, let's say, formed as you are?" The condescension in her voice was impossible to ignore. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the subtle inflection, the way she emphasized formed, as if suggesting that large segments of the public were somehow incapable of independent thought. The implication hovered over the table like a storm cloud. Robert's hands, which had been resting calmly on the arms of his chair, slowly tightened. The leather creaked faintly under his grip, his jaw flexed, and his eyes narrowed, not in anger, yet but in focus. The intensity that had defined so many of his iconic film performances began to surface. Though this time it wasn't scripted, informed, he repeated, correcting her choice of wording with quiet emphasis. His voice dropped slightly, not louder but heavier, each syllable deliberate. "Are you suggesting that regular Americans can't think for themselves? That they need to be shielded from hearing different viewpoints?" The audience grew still. What had started as a provocative exchange was quickly evolving into something far more personal and philosophical. The question wasn't just about celebrity activism anymore. It was about respect, about who gets to speak, who gets to decide what's appropriate, and who determines what the public can handle. Joy let out a dismissive laugh, the sharp sound cutting through the studio like nails scraping across glass. It wasn't a warm chuckle meant to lighten the mood. It carried a tone of mockery, as if she believed his argument was exaggerated. "I'm just saying," she replied, waving her hand lightly, "that when someone like you speaks, people listen. Maybe you should be more careful about what you're putting out there." The phrase "more careful" seemed to land like a spark in dry grass. "More careful?" Robert echoed slowly, leaning back in his chair. His voice dropped into that dangerously quiet register, soft enough to force everyone to listen more closely, yet intense enough to make the room feel smaller. Anyone familiar with his film career recognized that tone. It was the calm before a cinematic eruption, except this wasn't a movie set. "Let me ask you something, Joy," he continued, locking eyes with her. "How long have you been telling people what to think on this show?" A collective breath caught in the studio. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances. The tension was no longer subtle. It was palpable. Whoopi Goldberg attempted to interject with a lighthearted comment, perhaps hoping humor could diffuse the escalating standoff. Her smile flickered uncertainly as she opened her mouth to speak, but Joy brushed the attempt aside. clearly unwilling to relinquish control of the moment. "I've been in this business for decades." "Bobby," Joy shot back, her tone tightening. "I think I know a thing or two about responsibility." The use of the wrong name did not go unnoticed. Robert's expression hardened further. "It's Robert," he corrected firmly, his voice no longer merely irritated but resolute. The correction wasn't petty, it was pointed. It was about respect, about boundaries that had already been discussed and disregarded. "And responsibility," he continued, leaning forward slightly now, his posture no longer defensive but assertive. "You want to talk about responsibility? Let's talk about the responsibility of journalists to ask real questions, instead of setting up gotcha moments to serve their own agenda." The words landed with unmistakable weight. They were not shouted, yet they carried the force of an accusation. The atmosphere inside the studio shifted yet again, this time from tense debate to open confrontation. The audience, unsure whether to applaud or remain silent, chose stillness. Joy's face flushed red. Whether from anger or embarrassment, it was hard to tell. The confident smirk she had worn earlier was gone, replaced by a tight expression that suggested she had not anticipated being challenged so directly. For a split second, the polished rhythm of daytime television faltered. There were no clever transitions, no playful asides, only two strong personalities locked in a battle over principle, perception, and power. What had begun as a discussion about celebrity influence had evolved into a broader argument about media ethics, public discourse, and the delicate balance between freedom of speech and public responsibility. The exchange was no longer about politics alone. It was about who controls the narrative and who gets to define the limits of expression. And as the cameras continued to roll, capturing every flicker of emotion and every charged pause, it became clear that this was no ordinary interview. It was a clash of convictions unfolding in real time, unscripted and unfiltered, with millions watching to see who would yield first, if either of them would at all. It was becoming painfully clear that this confrontation was not unfolding the way she had anticipated. Joy had spent decades navigating heated discussions with politicians, activists, authors, and Hollywood stars. She was accustomed to applying pressure, to asking pointed questions that made her guests squirm. And more often than not, she was used to seeing them retreat, offering diplomatic answers, nervous laughter, or carefully rehearsed publicist-approved statements. What she wasn't accustomed to was a guest pushing back with equal intensity, refusing to yield an inch of ground. "I think you're being a little dramatic," she said finally, attempting to steady the situation. Her voice carried a thin layer of forced composure, as though she were trying to shrink the magnitude of what had just happened. "This is just a conversation." But the word conversation seemed to ignite something in him. "No," Robert shot back immediately, his voice rising not to a shout, but enough to break the controlled rhythm he had maintained until now. "This isn't a conversation." He leaned forward slightly, his posture no longer guarded but confrontational. "A conversation means two people actually listening to each other. What you're doing is trying to manufacture a sound bite that makes me look bad so you can feel superior." The words landed with stunning clarity. There was no laughter in the studio now, no polite applause. The audience, moments earlier unsure whether to react, had fallen completely silent. The air felt heavier, charged with the kind of tension that makes every second stretch longer than it should. Even the faint hum of studio equipment seemed louder against the stillness. It was the kind of silence where you could imagine hearing a pin drop across the table. The other hosts shifted uncomfortably. Eyes darted back and forth between Joy and Robert, as though they were watching a match that had suddenly turned far more serious than anyone intended. This wasn't playful banter, it wasn't political sparring disguised as entertainment. It was a direct clash between one of Hollywood's most formidable screen presences and one of daytime television's most seasoned provocateers. Joy inhaled sharply. She could feel the momentum slipping from her grasp. "I think you need to calm down," she replied, her tone softening into something unmistakably patronizing. It was a tone viewers had heard before, a blend of Fox concern and subtle dismissal, as though she were speaking to someone overreacting rather than engaging in legitimate criticism. That was the tipping point. Robert's eyes flashed, not with theatrical fury but with genuine indignation. "Calm down," he repeated, the disbelief in his voice evident. He straightened in his chair, shoulders squared, the full weight of his presence suddenly dominating the space. "You bring me here under false pretenses. You ambush me with loaded questions that we explicitly agreed were off limits. You repeatedly disrespect me by calling me the wrong name. And then you tell me to calm down when I call you out on it?" Each sentence was sharper than the last, not shouted but delivered with controlled intensity. The accusation of bad faith hung heavily in the air. It wasn't just about political commentary anymore. It was about trust, about boundaries, about professional courtesy that he believed had been violated the moment the questioning veered. Of course, Joy's expression shifted. For a fleeting second, uncertainty flickered across her face. She realized, perhaps too late, that she might have underestimated both his resolve and the public's perception of the exchange. This wasn't playing out as a clever confrontation that would generate a few headlines and fade by the next news cycle. It felt bigger than that, more volatile. Yet her pride stood firmly in the way of any immediate retreat. Years of commanding the table had conditioned her to hold her ground. Even when the situation grew uncomfortable, backing down now would mean conceding that she had misjudged the moment and perhaps overstepped. The studio lights seemed harsher somehow, reflecting off tense expressions and clenched jaws. The audience remained motionless, fully aware that they were witnessing something rare, an unscripted collision between two powerful personalities, neither willing to surrender the narrative. Behind the scenes, producers exchanged anxious glances. Someone whispered urgently into a headset. This was live television. There was no editing, no trimming the sharp edges before the footage reached viewers. Every word, every pause, every tightening of a jaw was being broadcast in real time to millions of homes. Robert's breathing was steady but visibly controlled, as though he were fighting the urge to escalate further. His frustration wasn't explosive in the dramatic sense. It was measured, focused, and therefore far more intimidating. He wasn't lashing out blindly. He was articulating exactly why he felt cornered and disrespected. Joy, meanwhile, seemed caught between doubling down and pivoting away. The confidence that had marked her earlier tone had thinned, replaced by something more defensive. She opened her mouth as if to respond, then hesitated, a rare pause for someone known for her quick retorts. In that suspended moment, the dynamic of the show shifted. The usual hierarchy, the host steering, the guest reacting, had inverted. Now it was Robert dictating the emotional temperature of the room, his challenge hanging unanswered. Viewers at home could sense it too. This wasn't just about one interview gone wrong. It was about the broader friction between media personalities and the public figures they question, about the fine line between accountability and provocation, about whether tough questions become something else when they're delivered with a hint of mockery. Joy knew she had pushed hard, perhaps harder than necessary, but her ego, honed by years of televised debates, refused to let her fully concede. The question was no longer whether she had crossed a line, it was whether she would admit it. That sentence, delivered with a clipped tone and a faintly superior tilt of her chin, became the spark that ignited everything. It was the precise instant when the fragile thread of restraint Robert had been clinging to finally snapped. For several seconds before that remark, he had managed to maintain some measure of composure, even as frustration simmered beneath the surface. But being told to stick to acting, as though his craft disqualified him from having informed opinions, struck deeper than any previous jab. The transformation was immediate and unmistakable. The controlled, measured man who had been choosing his words carefully was gone. In his place stood the fierce intensity that audiences had witnessed for decades on the big screen. Except this time it wasn't scripted dialogue. It wasn't a character shaped by a director's vision. It was raw, unfiltered emotion. For a split second, viewers could almost see echoes of the hardened figures he had portrayed in classics like Taxi Driver, Goodfellas, and Casino. The familiar fire in his eyes, the coiled energy in his posturate all resurfaced, not as performance, but as personal conviction unleashed. "Professionals," he roared, the word exploding from him with such force that several audience members physically jolted in their seats. The studio, moments ago thick with tension, now felt electrified. His voice reverberated off the walls, cutting through the artificial brightness of the set lights. There was no mistaking the anger in it now. No careful modulation, no polite restraint. "You think you're a professional?" he continued, leaning forward in his chair, his body language shifting dramatically. The relaxed posture was gone, his shoulders were squared, his presence commanding and intense. There was something almost predatory in the way he fixed his gaze on Joy, unblinking and unwavering. The camera operators, sensing the gravity of the moment, instinctively zoomed in. Every flicker of emotion, every tightening muscle in his jaw, every flash of indignation in his eyes was captured in stark detail for millions of viewers at home. "Let me tell you what a professional looks like," he said, his voice dropping slightly but retaining its edge. The shift made it even more chilling. It wasn't uncontrolled shouting anymore, it was focused, deliberate fury. A professional does their homework, a professional respects their guests, a professional doesn't sit there with a smug little smirk, thinking they're going to humiliate someone on national television just to feed their own ego. The accusation hung heavily in the air. The studio audience remained frozen, unsure whether to react. Some faces showed shock, others reflected a kind of stunned fascination. This was no longer a heated exchange, it was a full-blown confrontation, unfolding live without the safety net of editing. Joy attempted to interject, lifting her hand with a dismissive wave as though to reclaim control. But before she could form a coherent response, his voice cut through her attempt like a blade slicing cleanly through fabric. "No," he said firmly, his tone brooking no interruption. "You don't get to talk now. You've been talking for the last 10 minutes without saying a damn thing worth hearing." The bluntness of the statement sent another ripple through the room. It was rare for a guest, especially one of his stature, to speak so directly to a host on live television, but the dam had broken, and he wasn't holding anything back. "You brought me here to promote a film, remember?" he pressed on, his finger now tapping emphatically against the table. "Instead, you decided to play your little games. You ask loaded questions, twist the narrative, and when I don't dance to your tune, you tell me to calm down." The phrase "dance to your tune" carried a sting, recalling his earlier rejection of the idea that he was there merely for entertainment. His frustration was no longer subtle, it was a declaration. Round the table, the other hosts appeared, paralyzed. No one seemed certain whether stepping in would diffuse the situation or make it worse. Whoopi Goldberg's mouth hung open in visible disbelief, her usual quick wit momentarily absent. Sarah sat rigidly, her expression betraying a clear desire to shrink into her chair and disappear from the unfolding spectacle. The atmosphere felt almost surreal, as though everyone present realized they were witnessing a moment that would dominate headlines by nightfall. "You know what your problem is?" he continued, now pointing a finger directly at Joy. His voice carried that unmistakable Brooklyn edge, gritty, forceful, unapologetic. It was the same cadence that had once sent shivers through movie audiences, but here it felt even more powerful, because it was unscripted. "You think being loud and obnoxious makes you smart. You think interrupting people and talking over them makes you tough." He paused just long enough for the weight of his words to sink in. "All it really makes you is rude." The bluntness of the final sentence cut deeper than the shouting that preceded it. It was stripped of theatrics, just a simple, pointed accusation. The silence that followed was deafening. No music played to soften the blow. No commercial break immediately rescued the show from its spiraling intensity. The cameras kept rolling, documenting every stunned expression in the studio. Producers could be seen gesturing frantically offstage, unsure whether to signal for a break or let the moment play out. For viewers at home, the scene felt almost cinematic, yet uncomfortably real. This wasn't a carefully choreographed outburst designed for dramatic effect. It was a collision between pride and principle, between provocation and patience worn thin. Joy's face, once confident and composed, now revealed a mixture of anger and disbelief. She had challenged countless guests before, often steering conversations into turbulent waters without losing control, but this time, the current had turned against her. Robert's breathing was heavier now, though he remained seated, his body still leaning forward as if braced for whatever came next. The legendary composure that had defined so many public appearances had indeed shattered. But what replaced it was not chaos, it was conviction, delivered with unapologetic force.